Hi, and welcome to Prepping Essentials, and another in our video series on lessons learned. If the COVID-19 crisis has taught us nothing else, it's certainly demonstrated the fragility of the supply chain and just how quickly the supermarket shelves can run dry. So in this video, I thought I'd talk about the subject of emergency food stores. Well, here we are with another lessons learned video. I've done a lot of videos on the channel on the subject of food, or more specifically emergency long-term food storage, and it can't be done enough really, because it is one of the most important things that you will need to do as a prepper. Food and water, essentials in life, you can't not have them. And there is that famous quote about everyone's only 3 meals away from anarchy, and we clearly saw that in the COVID crisis as it started to dawn on people back in March that there was something wrong, and we might be following other countries by going into national lockdowns. The panic really did set in, and it made the media quite a lot actually. In terms of long-term food storage, I've been doing this for, I can't even think how long now. Properly, I've been doing it for about 6 years, which is around the time that I started living on a canal boat. And I did that for 2 years, and I think at that point self-sufficiency and living off grid really hit home, and I realised that I needed to have some kind of long-term food stores with me in the boat. So that's where it started really gaining momentum. Having lived overseas for a long time in my career to date, the idea of setting stuff aside in terms of food and other supplies, the seeds were really sown back then, as countries I went to just didn't have the stuff that I was used to having, and I used to go back after having trips at home for my 1 week, 2 week holiday, wherever it was, and the amount of suitcases I used to take back, not full of clothes but full of food items or toiletries, things that were not readily available in those countries. So there's a bit of a long history there going back over the years as to how I evolved into the prepping lifestyle, and more importantly for this video, how I started to set aside long-term stores of food. So what have I learned? In terms of long-term food storage, you're going to need to have somewhere that's cool, dark and dry to set aside your stores. Otherwise, they're going to start going off. They need to be stored in containers that's resistant to rodents, because things like insects and mice, or worse, rats, will definitely try and get in there. In terms of your dry goods, and we'll touch on what those are in a second, whilst store-bought packaging will retain shelf life for a year or two, depending what it is, it's always better, if you can, to get those into either vacuum sealed bags, or if you don't have a vacuum sealer, into some airtight containers with some oxygen absorbers in them. It'll just help prolong the shelf life of the food. If you're storing lots of frozen food, I don't actually store a lot of frozen food. My freezer is quite small. Um, so whilst I do store food in the freezer and it's always full, it's mainly meat that I store in the freezer. If you are relying on freezers, and nothing wrong with that, it's a great way of extending the life of your food. Just bear in mind what would happen if the power went out. Do you have an alternative power supply that will at least keep your freezer and your refrigerator going kind of indefinitely, really? It's no good saying, oh, I've got 3 weeks worth of energy stored up if the crisis lasts 4 weeks or 10 weeks. So when you're looking at alternate energy supplies for things like fridges and freezers, think long term, think permanent. Can that sustain? Um, there's a whole range of different alternate energy sources out there, and I've done quite a few videos on the channel on that subject. I have a petrol generator that'll provide mains electric, but again, fuel for that generator will be finite in a grid down crisis. So unless you've got the facility to store huge supplies of fuel, really you want to be looking elsewhere. And regular viewers to the channel will have seen my off-grid cabin build, and I've put a solar electric system in there. That really is the most simplest and sustainable method of getting alternate energy for an off-grid scenario. So yeah, freezers, if you do have them, that's great. They really are very, very good at storing food long term, but just do bear in mind you're going to need a power supply. Wherever you're storing, it needs to be quite accessible. You are going to have to go into their long-term stores at some point to rotate out the food supply and to use up the ones that are coming towards their end of life and replace them with new stores. For me, that's something that I have found difficulty with. Not in that my food stores are not readily accessible. They are. Almost all of my canned goods are in my kitchen. Really, the only things that aren't in the kitchen are bulk dried foods and things like toiletries and clothing and other bits and pieces, which are stored in the roof space in the house. But even so, it still is difficult to remember to check every now and again. What tends to happen is that everything gets put away and you tot it all up and you go, yeah, I've got 6 months, I've got 8 months, I've got whatever length of time with these stored foods. And you kind of forget about it and you just go about your daily business, and every now and again you'll pick up the odd bit and piece to top up. And it's only really then that you suddenly remember, oh, hang on, let me just check the expiry date. Now, because space is in a premium in my kitchen, it is very small. Everything tends to be packed into a very small space, which makes rotating out quite difficult. I'm having to drag out lots of different things to get to the pile of the one thing it is I'm rotating out, if that makes sense. So let's say I'm moving tins of beans and sausages and mixed vegetables and soups to get to the canned potatoes, and vice versa. Now I hope it makes sense. So yeah, keep it accessible so that you can get to it in a hurry and rotate out as and when necessary, which kind of brings me to the next subject, which is if you're having to bug out and leave your home because of the grid down scenario and go to a fallback location, or to go to your rural homestead or your cabin in the woods, or whatever it is that your plan is to do if living in your house becomes untenable, you're going to have to take it with you, or as much as you possibly can with you. So have a little think about how you would do that. If your only method of bugging out is on foot, you're pretty buggered, really, because you're not going to be able to take an awful lot of stuff with you. And whilst you do need food, you also need other things if you're going to be getting your rucksack on and walking off out into the fields or the hills or the woods. So have a little thought about what you would do to move as much as you possibly can of your long-term food supplies should you need to leave your house and go to another location. If you have a vehicle to hand, that's great, you can load up your vehicle. Do bear in mind though that in a grid down scenario, you might find it's difficult getting out of where you live because lots of other people might also be doing that. So bear that in mind. If you do have somewhere to go to already, a pre-planned bug out location, then consider putting stores into that location in advance. Or maybe, and you'll see this on a lot of channels, consider having caches of supplies stored at various points along your route to your final bug out location. Lots of different scenarios, but don't overlook the fact that whilst it's great to have your house all set up and you've got all your supplies in place, there is always that possibility that for whatever reason you might need to leave. I don't know, hurricane comes through, civil disorder, mayhem on the streets, and everyone's going house to house, stealing everything. Whatever the scenario, just have a little think about that. Don't ignore the fact that at some point you might need to move somewhere. So that kind of brings us on to the next topic of what it is that you need to store. In terms of items, the list is endless, but let's start off with the main overriding principles. And the first amongst those, I guess, is that you should store what you eat and eat what you store. And I kind of touched on that earlier. Store foods that you know you and your family members are going to eat. You know, don't just get 100 kilos of rice if you don't like rice, or family members don't like rice. It's going to be a bit of a miserable existence for you. Whilst it'll sustain you, if you don't like it, it just adds to the misery. Another kind of overriding rule, I do this a lot and I've mentioned it no end of times in previous videos, and that's the subject of having food which is either already cooked and doesn't need much heating, or which doesn't need water to reconstitute it. I mentioned rice just now. Rice is fantastic, but if you've got no water, you're stuffed, really. So things that you can eat straight out the can, hot or cold, doesn't need cooking, and wherever possible, doesn't need water to reconstitute it. Also think about the type of food that it is you're storing, because you are going to need all of the essential proteins, carbs, calories, minerals. You're going to need all of those to have a balanced diet. You can't really just live on one type of food. You need lots of different food groups in order to maintain that healthy diet, and in a mixture of different quantities. And I have kind of touched on this already. Don't just think about yourself, think about who else might be with you. So all of your different family members or extended family members, or if you have a plan to form a group, so various friends or family members will be coming to one location to operate as a group, think about them. Different people have different dietary requirements. Some people might be food intolerant to certain things. They'll have an allergy. things like nuts, for example, or dairy products. And also different age ranges have different requirements. Old people need a different balance of food than young people, and younger people, like babies, have a quite specific dietary requirement. The younger they are, the more likely it is that they're only going to be living on milk for a while. So consider that also, the people within your group and the type of foods that they can eat and enjoy, or can't eat because it presents a problem for them. So we're kind of into individual foods now, and as I said, the list is endless, but it can be grouped into different areas. First and foremost is your staples. So these are things that form the basis of your diet. So generally these will be bulk dried stores rather than packets or cans or jars. So consider things like rice, which I've mentioned earlier, is a staple. I think there's something like half the world's population, rice is their basic meal every day. And they clearly survive on it because there are billions of them. So yeah, rice, great. Stores almost indefinitely if you keep it in the right conditions and keep it airtight. Very simple to make a meal out of. The only downside, I guess, with rice and all of your dried stuff is that you do need water to reconstitute it and to cook it. So in addition to rice, what do I store? I store oats. I store a lot of oats. Again, they're a great all-round staple that you can eat as a meal in itself. And indeed I do. My breakfast, I have porridge every day. So again, it's very simple to store, will store for very long periods of time if it's kept in the right conditions. Next, in the dried foods, there's a vast range of different bean products that come in dried form. For me personally, I only store a small number of these. I store the ones with the biggest bang for buck generally, and things that will complement a meal easily. So I store red kidney beans. I store the white butter beans. I don't know what you call those elsewhere in the world. Don't know. They're butter beans. You have to Google it. And then I store lentils, and you'll have seen those again in previous videos, and indeed you'll have seen me cooking with red kidney beans and lentils in different videos that I've put out on the channel. There are lots of others, and I think depending on where you are in the world, you'll have your own favourite beans. But they're great. They're filled with lots of protein and calories, and depending what they are, different minerals and vitamins. But they're simple, and they do make a welcome addition to a basic meal, especially if it's rice, for example, just to give it a bit of variety and a bit of different taste, and to, again, help bulk out that meal. Yeah, so beans, plenty of those. Other dried foods, and you'll have seen that I store sugar and flour. The flour is pretty obvious, really. It's for baking, cooking cakes and breads and pastries. Sugar, again, pretty obvious. I only actually use sugar in tea and coffee on a daily basis, and then really after that only if I'm doing some baking. But I do store quite a lot of sugar and flour because longer term, again, you are going to have to start producing your own cake, bread, pastries, and you are going to have some kind of sweetener or something to put into those cakes that you're baking. I guess you could consider yeast as a bulk dried food store. Obviously you're going to need that if you're going to be doing any baking. So again, I do store yeast. So as I say, there's an endless range of the dried foods that can be stored. Almost forgot one other pretty important one, that's milk. I do store quite a bit of dry powder milk. Um, Again, it's easy to reconstitute, it's easy to store, um, rather than having to get, I do have some of those Tetra Pak, those waxed cardboard cartons full of long life milk. I do have those, but they're not in the long-term store. They're in my pantry as a reserve in case I run out of the normal milk that I use every day. Um, that was in short supply, as was powdered milk. Indeed, everything I've said almost up to now was in short supply at the start of the COVID crisis. So it kind of proves a point that you should have them, even if the crisis is short-lived, as indeed it was. The supply chain through the COVID crisis has very quickly re-established itself, and supermarket shelves have been stocked again. But in that interim, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 week period when it was a bit chaotic, if you didn't have those items on hand, you would be complaining a lot, I suspect. That kind of moves us on to the next major group on the long-term food stores, which is canned goods. You can include jars and packets, I guess, into this group. Again, there's a vast variety, but generally there are some common themes in terms of canned goods. I did initially start out storing an endless variety of different things in cans, but as time went by, I quickly realised that there were easier ways to do it, and if you're going to have extensive canned goods supplies, you do need a lot of space. You can't compact down the cans like you can with your bulk dried foods. You can vacuum seal those and reduce the packaging volume significantly, but you can't do that with cans. The can is the can, the jar is the jar. It's not going to get any smaller no matter what you do to it. So you have to store it as it is. In terms of what I store in cans, there still is a large variety, but not as large as it used to be. Mainly, it's canned potatoes and canned mixed vegetables. I quickly stopped storing individual types of vegetable, peas, carrots, beans, so on and so forth. So the bulk of my canned goods stock is canned potatoes and canned mixed vegetables. There are a few others that I store, mainly as filler items or to make something a little bit different for variety. So things like tinned tomatoes, tinned sweet corn, tinned mushrooms, but not in the same quantity as the potatoes and the mixed vegetables. They are the bulk of them. Other canned food groups is meats and fishes. I store a lot of canned meat and canned fish. Deal with the fish first in terms of variety. In all fairness, sardines are pretty much the only fish that I store. I don't store tuna at all. It's kind of a personal preference, really. I do prefer sardine over tuna. And as an individual, I find that the portion size in sardines is a meal, whereas the tuna tends to be a little bit more than a meal for one person. And fish, once it's opened, you've got to eat that straight away. You can't leave it for the next day. So yeah, in terms of fish, mine are exclusively tinned sardines. There might be the odd can of mackerel hiding in there somewhere, but it's sardines. Meats, big variety on meats, and you'll have seen in previous videos. There's your traditional blocks of meat in which I store corned beef, and our UK take on spam. It's bacon grill or luncheon meat, and large quantities of those. Outside of that, I did used to store things like pies, but I don't do that anymore. They're just a pain to cook, particularly off grid. But I do store lots and lots and lots of hot dogs. There's a little trigger there for a few people, because I'm constantly amazed at the number of people who just have this hate relationship with canned hot dogs. I do store lots of those. They're so simple and easy, and as with pretty much all canned goods, you can eat them straight out the can. There's no cooking required. Some are a lot better if you cook them, obviously, but you don't have to. Other things in cans and jars. Soup. I store a lot of cans of soup in different flavours. They're good as a meal in itself. They're also good to use as a thick sauce for things like pasta. So you can make a meal. I think I did a video on that once. Pasta and soup as a meal. You'll have to scroll back and have a look. But yeah, soups. Lots and lots of those in my long-term food store. Other things. I think meals in a can. I've mentioned that quite a few times. So I have cans of ready-made chili con carne, spaghetti bolognese, and there's also cans of we call it ravioli. It's like pasta with a meat filling inside. Don't know if you call that the same elsewhere in the world. Meatballs, quite a few of those. More for variety than anything else. The bulk of my canned meat is the spam, bacon grill, whatever you want to call it, and the corned beef. Other things, you've got some quick packet staples that I use. I use these more as a short-term emergency food supply rather than long-term, or indeed in some cases for regular meals. So we're talking about things like microwave or boil in the bag rice. I always have lots of those on hand. Instant sachets of porridge. So it's your porridge oats with, some of them have milk powder inside. Mine doesn't. I use milk for mine. And some kind of flavouring inside. Mine is golden syrup. So it's single portion size. You just add your milk, microwave it, done. You've got porridge every morning. So I do store loads of those as well. Other kind of staples in a packet, you've got packet soups. I don't have too many of those now. I used to store a lot of those. But I find that having the canned soups is easier. It's already constituted. You don't need to add water to it to use. And of course, the prepper staple, ramen noodles. Again, some people have a love-hate relationship with that. But I do store lots of noodles. They're very, very quick. They are a meal in a packet. And whilst they're not going to give you everything you need, you certainly couldn't live off them. They're great as a quick, easy meal if you're in a hurry or if you're on the move. You can quickly knock up a meal with a bag of ramen noodles and a can of meat. That kind of brings us on to the add-in extras, but things that you don't want to forget. So we've got things like condiments and sauces and oils. So in terms of condiments, long-term store salt, pepper, short-term sort of spices. I don't have that many spices in my long-term stores, to be honest. Outside of maybe making a chili or perhaps in baking, I don't really use them day to day. But salt and pepper you do need. particularly salt. Salt is something that should have been on my dry long-term stores, because I do store that in bulk, and vacuum seal that. It is an essential in anybody's diet, actually, and long-term grid down, it would also be useful as a barter item. People are going to want salt and sugar, so good barter items, even if you don't use that much yourself, it's worth having long-term stores. Stock cubes, or I think the American cousins call it bouillon. So your little either powder form or block form. Again, store lots of those to add flavour to meals where you perhaps don't have a lot of meat, to help provide some flavour. So generally there's 3 varieties that I have, is beef, chicken and normal vegetable. So I use those in everyday cooking, but primarily they're for long-term storage when you start to rely on your dried goods and you want to add that bit of flavour and variety to your meals. Similar, powdered gravy, store that. Jams, jellies, don't store a lot of jams, to be fair. It's not something that I regularly eat, though having said that, as a source of energy, calories, it's good, and it's something I might explore now that I've got my land and I've got a plethora of wild fruits that I can use to make jams with, so I might explore that in future videos. Tomato sauces and other types of sauce. I do have stores in cans and in these Tetra Pak waxed cardboard cartons of tomato sauce, and a variety of curry sauces, again to add variety to meals. I do enjoy things like spaghetti bolognese, so for that reason alone I have lots of tomato sauce on hand. Some other things that are worth considering: honey, great as a sweetener, also as medicinal purposes. I don't store a huge amount of honey, to be fair, but I think long-term off-grid honey does last an awful long time, so if you do run out of sugar you can use that as a fallback. And if you're making cakes, sometimes you have honey as an ingredient in the cake mix. Vitamin pills, that's something I do store. As you start to delve into your long-term stores, you might not be getting all of the essential vitamins and minerals that you need if you've not put aside enough of a variety of foodstuffs in your stores. So I do keep, I've got at least a year's supply of vitamins, multivitamins, and in my case cod liver oil. Cod liver oil is great, particularly as you get older, if you start getting achy joints. So I do store that. I don't take them generally on a day-to-day basis. They are there as a supplement just in case the grid does go down and I can't get access to sufficient variety. I should, but you never know. And they're very easily to take with you as well if you do have to bug out and you are without your long-term stores. Final few things. A bit of an oddball. Protein powder. I've seen lots of people talk about protein powder recently on YouTube as a potential prepping item. I do have it actually, because quite often I have that for lunch, a protein shake. So just mix the powder with some water, give it a shake, and it's a meal. That's not because I'm on some big health kick or anything like that. It's just convenience at work. It's easy to do, and I don't really have access, and I can't be bothered to be cooking stuff, and I certainly can't afford to be sending out for meals. So it's a simple, easy, compact meal in a jar. um, but it is a meal, and it's a meal substitute. That's what it's designed to do, and it comes in these huge 5 kilo buckets, which last, well, months. So why not? It's not a bad idea, actually, to have a 5 kilo tub of this. I mean, I don't store it for storing's sake, but I always have at least one sitting in the pantry because I do use it. So again, it's like a little emergency supply tucked away that you don't even think about. There's bound to be lots of stuff that I've missed off my list as I've kind of rambled on. But as we get to the end, I just want to reiterate a couple of key things. Long-term food storage is designed to get you either through a short-term crisis, so something big happens, the normal life as we know it stops or is massively disrupted for 2 months, 6 months, 10 months, and then it returns to normal. A bit like it did with the COVID crisis, or has done so far with the COVID crisis. Unless you're a billionaire and you've got some underground huge bunker, you're not going to be able to store away enough food if things don't go back to normal in a fairly short period of time. And I count a year as a fairly short period of time. So in the back of your mind, you would always need to be thinking of, what am I going to do if the crisis is prolonged and my food stores run out? So have a little think about the types of crisis that you think could realistically impact you, and have the objective of setting aside sufficient food stores to ride out that crisis with the expectation that things will return gradually to normal in some way, shape or form. But also have in the back of your mind, what would you do if they didn't? And there are a couple of key things to think about there. Most obvious and most acceptable and suitable response would be, I'm going to grow a self-sufficiency garden, which is what I'm trying to do here on the land. You can use your long-term stores to supplement, where necessary, what you're producing in your garden. And if you're fortunate enough and you have sufficient time and money and land available to you, you should be quite quickly able to become self-sufficient in certainly vegetables, over time fruits perhaps, and over time in meat. You can rear chickens and goats and rabbits and whatever else. So consider, if you haven't started even a small-scale garden to get the practice, consider doing that now. And with that in mind, don't neglect in your long-term preps to put away seeds. I know from my own experience how difficult it is to replace what it is that you've been growing over the season without being able to go into a cupboard and pull out a packet of seeds. Some crops seed better than others. Some crops take 2 years to produce seeds. So you need something that you can rely on as one crop finishes to be able to replant another crop. So don't neglect seeds. And then finally, kind of linked in with the self-sufficiency garden, you can use hunting and foraging as a way of supplementing that garden, or if you don't have one, as a substitute for that garden. There's an abundance of wildlife out there that is edible, whether that's plant-based or animal-based, in pretty much everywhere where people live. So take a little bit of time to work out what skills you need to be able to harvest that plant or animal. and to process and cook that plant or animal, and what equipment you might need in order to catch or harvest the plant or catch the animal. Not as easy as it sounds. Having done that for real, walking out into the woods and shooting yourself a squirrel, rabbit, deer, pheasant, whatever, isn't a straightforward exercise. It does need skill, it does need experience, and it does need equipment to do that. And similarly, as I'm learning with my self-sufficiency garden, being able to successfully produce plants and get them to harvest is a skill in itself, which I am still learning every day lately. So yeah, have a little think about how you would be able to supplement or substitute your foods by foraging and hunting. But one last point on that subject, what you also have to bear in mind is that in a proper grid down scenario, you're going to have some competition, because as the supermarkets run out, everybody is going to be thinking, what can I do to replace the supermarket? And gradually, some more quickly than others, they're going to realise that they're either going to have to go out and steal it from you, potentially, or they're going to have the same idea. They're going to go out and think, I'm going to go fishing, I'm going to go hunting, I'm going to go foraging. So whatever resource is available out in the wild, that will very quickly diminish as more and more people turn to that as a source of food. So there's an awful lot in there to take in, and equally there's probably an awful lot that didn't pass through my mind as I was going through that. So do feel free to suggest other things that I might have missed in the comments section, and to just I'm always keen for people to comment on what it is that they're doing, what it is that they've learned that I might not know, or others viewing the video might not know. But it's a very long, in-depth subject. You can't cover it in a short chat session like this. So do feel free to scroll back through my videos. Do equally feel free to get out there into YouTube. There are lots of preppers out there, many far more experienced than I am, who can offer some good advice on the subject of long-term food storage. But hopefully this has been of some use to you. Well, that's it for this video. I hope there was something in there that was of interest to you. If you did like the video, please do click on the like button. Also feel free to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. As always, welcome any comments, questions or suggestions you might have. Feel free to leave them in the comments section below. But for now, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.